Welcome, everyone, to the second Halloween edition of the Perception and Action podcast. I'm Rob Gray from ASU, your tour guide through haunted realms of distorted perception and twisted action. Enter if you dare. Our evil tale for this evening concerns the effect of fear on perception and performance. When we talk about skilled performance, we can think of several different types of fear that are relevant. Fear of death, fear of injury and re-injury, fear of failure, fear of success, and fear of pain or discomfort. But what effect does fear actually have on how we perceive the world and how we act on it? Is fear in a performer a debilitating problem that must be overcome? Like I talked about back in episode 19B when I reviewed the book by Grand and Goldberg about dealing with performance anxiety? Or can fear actually be helpful in some situations? In terms of observable behavior, the most common act people associate with fear is freezing. That is becoming rigid and immobile. It also typically involves bradycardia, or an abnormally low heart rate. I think for most people, the term freezing conjures up a negative image, something like a deer in the headlights, where a performer is completely unable to react and helpless. However, it's actually been shown that freezing is a highly effective defensive behavior that has been preserved through evolution and has several benefits. So much so that it should really be called something like attentive stillness rather than freezing. Let's look at some of the benefits of the freezing response. In terms of perception, becoming suddenly immobile due to fear has a couple immediate benefits. First, because motion is such a powerful cue we use to separate objects from their background, you become less visible to an opponent on the field or a predator in the woods. Second, your vision becomes more sensitive. I've actually shown this in a couple of my own studies, in which we measured people's ability to judge the time to collision and direction of travel of approaching objects. When we only simulated the object moving, responses were on average 20% more accurate as compared to when we simulated both the object and the person moving. So in other words, when we are stationary, we are much more sensitive to the movement of the other objects in our environment. The most parsimonious explanation for this effect is based on signal-to-noise ratio. When both objects in the world are moving, the motion signal on the retina is a combination of the two that we must somehow decompose into the object motion signal and the self-motion signal. This improvement in visual perception with freezing is not just restricted to motion perception. In a 2015 study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General, Lojowska and colleagues examined the ability of participants to see details in static images and how this changed when fear was induced via the threat of receiving a shock. For this, they used a type of stimuli that has been used a lot in vision research because its characteristics can be precisely identified: Sine-Wave Gradings. I have included images of a couple different examples of these in the show notes. If you can't look right now, they are essentially patterns of alternating dark and light bars. There are three main parameters that can be varied: their orientation, that is whether the bars are horizontal, vertical, or slightly tilted; their contrast, that is whether there's a large difference in brightness between the bars, so for example, alternating black and white, or a small difference in brightness, for example, one set of the bars might be slightly different shade of gray than the other. The final parameter that can be varied is the spatial frequency, which is essentially how many bars there are on the screen. In a low spatial frequency display, the bars are large, so there's not many of them there. In a high spatial frequency display, the bars are small, so there's a ton of them packed into the display. In a typical experiment using these, you measure the lowest contrast, that is the smallest difference between the brightness of the bars, for which a person can reliably judge the orientation of the grading. If you repeat this over and over for a wide range of spatial frequencies, that is different sizes of bars, you get what is called the contrast sensitivity function, which is a highly sensitive and detailed measure of a person's vision. For example, these functions, also called CSFs, can be used to detect a variety of different visual disorders and track the development of a child's visual system. But let's get back to fear. In their study, Lojowska and colleagues measured participants' ability to discriminate the orientation of sine-wave gratings at two spatial frequencies, one high and one low. These measurements were made both in a baseline condition and a condition in which participants randomly received mild electric shocks. What was found? In the shock condition, the sensitivity for the low spatial frequency improved, while the sensitivity for the high spatial frequency got significantly worse. Across participants, they also found a significant positive correlation between the change in sensitivity for the sine wave gratings and the reduction in heart rate in response to the shock threat. In other words, a nice relationship between behavioral and physiological responses. So what is going on here? Well, imagine you are a football player returning a punt. Out of the corner of your eye, you see a huge player on the other team bearing down on you, so you momentarily freeze, due to the fear of getting pummeled. Remember, in the Lojowska study, it was found that fear improves sensitivity to low spatial frequencies and decreases it for high ones. High spatial frequency means more and smaller parts in the image. So in other words, we're talking about high resolution detail. Low spatial frequency means less and bigger parts in the image. So in other words, coarse detail. Think about this in terms of my football example. Do you really care about the details of the opponent that is about to hit you, such as their number, whether or not they have facial hair, and how many stickers they might have on their helmet? Heck no, these things are all irrelevant. The most important features are the very coarse ones. Where is the player? To my left, right, or straight ahead? And what direction are they moving in? It's also the case that coarse visual information, which is processed in the magnocellular pathway in our visual system, travels much faster than the detailed information, which travels along the parvocellular pathway. So in conditions of fear, it seems like our visual system is boosting the magnocellular signal and inhibiting the parvocellular one, so that we're more sensitive to coarse detail information we really need, and we get it more quickly. Before I leave the topic of perception, I should note that all the examples I've given rule out the possibility that increased sensitivity is due to you just being paranoid. Think about watching a horror movie by yourself on a stormy night. In this situation, most people feel like they have more sensitive hearing. That is, they can detect every small sound and noise around their house. In reality, this type of change is most likely due to a change in detection criteria rather than detection sensitivity. In other words, as a result of being scared by the movie, we're just more likely to think everything is a mysterious noise. Our hearing doesn't get more sensitive in reality. The studies I've discussed did an effective job of ruling out this criterion explanation.
All over this town, looking for something to bring me further down. Like I need a parade, one's just for me. On Halloween.
So, we seem to have enhanced perception when we freeze due to fear. But how does it affect how we act? In an interesting study published in Neuroscience Letters earlier this year, Gladwin and colleagues used a simulated police shooting task to study this. In particular, participants viewed the simulation of a suspicious-looking person in an underground garage. On threat trials, the person drew a gun, which they would then use to shoot at the participant after a short interval. If this shot occurred, the participant in the study would receive a mild electric shock. On safe trials, the person would pull out a cell phone. The other manipulation involved what the participant could do in response to this. On active trials, participants had their own simulated gun, which they could use to shoot the simulated criminal after they drew their gun, which would in turn prevent them from getting shocked. Finally, in a passive condition, participants had no gun and could do nothing. Both heart rate and body sway, measured using a stabilometer, were recorded during the period between when the participant first saw the criminal and they either pulled their gun or their phone out. So, this can be thought of as an anticipation period, which is identical for all conditions. What was found? Interestingly, freezing was strongest in both of the active conditions. That is when the participant had a gun of their own and could react. regardless of whether the simulated person had a gun or a phone. When the participant could respond, they showed greater reduction in heart rate and greater decrease in body sway. To me, this is strong evidence for the idea that freezing is an adaptive, functional response. In this study, participants only froze when they were able to react. They didn't freeze when they were completely helpless. So therefore, it must be involved in the preparation for reacting. Before I wrap it up today, I wanted to mention one more study that I found really interesting. In a paper published in 2015 in the journal Cortex, Borgomaneri and colleagues examined how fearful body language, such as another person cowering or covering up their eyes, affects activity in a person's motor cortex. So in other words, you are not viewing a threatening stimulus yourself, but rather are getting it secondhand by seeing how someone else is responding. I think this can be related back to an issue I talked about in episode 18b, where I considered whether choking under pressure is contagious or not. In this body language study, they used a technique I talked about back in episode 19d in my interview with Michael Gray. That is, TMS applied to the motor cortex to measure cortical spinal excitability. What was found? When viewing images of fearful body language, there was an immediate reduction in the excitability of the motor cortex, while there was no such change for images of happy or neutral body language. So, this again seems to be consistent with immobilization during freezing. This reduction in motor readiness in the cortex would support the perceptual effects I already discussed by making your body still, and may also make it so our reaction response is quicker and more precise. Well, that's it for today's episode. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at the trade-off between specificity and adaptability in training, and what this meant for my first ultramarathon. This is Rob Gray from ASU, from the Perception in Action podcast. Have a safe and happy Halloween, everyone.